Lovely. So nice to see you all. Welcome to the second half. My name's Akashamitra, and hi, come on in. I'm going to be talking in the second half of the class, and I'm going to be carrying on our exploration on what is the Sangha. So we're drawing material from this book by Sangharakshita, who's the founder of our order and movement. Is this out of print? I'm not sure if it's actually in print now. So you can't get hold of a copy, but it's great.
They can get it in complete works.
They can get it. Yeah, you can get it if you buy the complete works of Sangharakshita. I think you can occasionally pick up copies online on Amazon as well. It's a very, very good book. But so we're going to be carrying on with that this evening. Just out of interest, who was here for Jnanavaccha's talk last week? Okay, so quite a few of you were. So I will recap a little bit on what Jnanavaccha said, because it's relevant for this evening. This is part of a series on what is the Sangha, but you can drop in for individual evenings as well. So, and I'm going to slightly apologise in advance. This is a kind of middle-age milestone. I've just started wearing glasses, so I'm just kind of getting to grips with. I can't see you if I have them on, but I can't see my notes if I don't have them on. So I'm going to be doing quite a bit of that. So bear with me. So Jnanavaccha last week talked about the true individual. That was the title of his talk last week, the true individual. So can anyone remember what the qualities of a true individual were, or what a true individual is? For those of you that were here, obviously. Anything at all? Yes?
Not individualistic.
Right, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So I'm going to explore that in a minute, because it can be quite a problematic term, the difference between being an individual, in the sense that Sangharakshita means it, and being sort of individualistic. So a true individual is not individualistic. So I'll say what I mean by that in a moment. Anything else?
Is not psychologically dependent on other people.
Right, okay, so not psychologically dependent on other people, yeah. So in the sense that Sangharakshita means it, like a true individual is a very sort of spiritually advanced individual who, as Harvey was saying, is not kind of, has outgrown their own conditioning and is not prey to the conditions around them. So is not influenced by, not dependent on the people around them, not unduly influenced by the people around them, not influenced by the group. And I'm going to say what we mean by the group in a moment. And as you were saying, that's different from sort of being individualistic. It's subtly different. So I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So I was thinking about an example from my own life. So you won't believe this, but I didn't always look like a middle-aged man. So I was thinking about when I was younger, I used to be a goth. Does anybody remember goths? Yeah, okay. Like I personally, obviously, I'm a bit of an old man. I feel like it's a bit of a shame that we don't seem to have those kind of tribes anymore. It all seems a bit sort of generic, doesn't it? But back in my day, you had sort of goths and hippies and punks and skaters and that sort of thing. And basically, I was a goth, so I had really long hair, long dark hair. Used to wear eyeliner. Used to sometimes wear black nail varnish, stuff like that. Used to dress in black, tight black jeans. Christmas horrors. Find this very, very funny. I'll bring some photos in for you. And I used to listen to the Sisters of Mercy and Fields of the Nephilim and stuff like that. And it was really important. Being a goth was that was sort of how I defined myself. And not only was I a goth, but I definitely wasn't not a goth as well. So in my town, there was about 10 of us goths. There was only 2 pubs that we could go to. One was called Barrels and one was called the Brown Bear. We sort of preferred Barrels. We used to go to this cellar bar where they would play our tapes, and it was full of smoke downstairs, and we would all listen to the same Sisters of Mercy albums and stuff like that. And But it's interesting, like I overheard my mum saying once, she was talking to to a friend of hers, and she said, "Oh yeah, my kids don't follow fashion, like they do their own thing, you know, they're individuals basically." I mean, funny enough, my sister was a goth as well, which is, you know, I think that's more than any parent should have to deal with, is like more than one goth child. But anyway, so she had like 2 goth kids, and you know, she said, "Oh, they don't follow fashion, you know, they do their own thing." And it's like, well, kind of we did our own thing, but it was exactly the same as the other 8 goths in the town, you know. Like, so if anybody came into our goth pub wearing, like, the big thing, I don't know where this came from, but the thing in the late 80s and early 90s in our town was like the trendies, in inverted commas, used to wear stripy shirts. That was like meant you were really, really straight if you wore a stripy shirt. And I remember one night we were there in our goth pub, and somebody came in wearing a stripy shirt, and we were like, you know, we were outraged. Like, you don't wear a stripy shirt in barrels, you know. So it's ridiculous, isn't it? That sort of behaviour is like really, really individualistic. Like, you're sort of pitting yourself against other people, and it's sort of like an identity for its own sake, basically. And everybody in the group is sort of really intent on sort of preserving the kind of integrity of that group by everybody being like each other. So being a true individual is not that. It may be possible to be a goth and be a true individual, I'm not sure. Yeah, so not being individualistic in that sense, you're not just trying to be different, or you're not sort of deliberately behaving differently. It's just that you're not going to follow the crowd, basically. You're not just going to go along with certain viewpoints or certain groups. You're not going to be influenced unduly. You're going to have deeper values than that, basically. So values of compassion and wisdom, you know, as we talk about, as sort of embodied by the Buddha. So the true individual is very rare. So they're a kind of rare and precious being, and the spiritual community is even rarer because it's composed of true individuals. So this is the point that Bhante makes in the text. So you might think that you've come along to a spiritual community, and you might think that the London Buddhist is a spiritual community, but actually we're not that most of the time. So we're sort of aspiring to be that, but most of the time we're a group because we're not comprised of true individuals. So we can aspire to be a spiritual community, and occasionally we might glimpse that, but most of the time, because most of us are not true individuals, we're going to bring all sorts of assumptions and all sorts of conditioning to how we interact with each other and what we say and what we do. I mean, I was struck by this yesterday. We were here for Sangha Day, and I think it's interesting what happens when people get together, or when us as a community, when we get together. Like, I think something can happen when we get together and we practice together. I was really struck by this yesterday. Who was here for any of Sangha Day yesterday? So a few of you were. We had a festival yesterday celebrating the spiritual community, which we call Sangha Day. And I was just saying to Pranyamanas earlier, there was something really special about the atmosphere yesterday. It felt to me like an atmosphere of real kind of depth and openness, and I was partaking in that, and because of that I felt particularly open. My communication with people was slightly different, I noticed, from how it would be usually. And there's something that sort of arises on the basis of us coming together and practicing together. And I think that's when we start to have a glimpse of what it would actually be like to be a spiritual community. But often we're not that. So we're what Bhante calls a group, and I'll say a bit more about what that means in a moment. Because largely, most of the time, we're comprised of sort of ordinary folk, in inverted commas. And there's a Buddhist word for that, which I think is prithigjanas. which I hadn't heard before, but it basically just means like ordinary folk.
Prathagjana.
Say again?
Prathagjana.
Prathagjana. Okay, great. My pronunciation was slightly off. So nothing wrong. Well, there is something wrong with that actually. We can be much more than that, but that's what we are most of the time. So I thought it'd be interesting for you to think about. Okay, if we accept this, if you accept what I'm saying, that we're not true individuals and that actually we're subject to the influence of, let's say, the group, but actually what that means is lots of different groups. Who are we sort of influenced by? Who is it that most of the time, sort of conditions us or influences who we are and how we think? So just have a think about that for a moment. And who do you think it is that sort of influences us? Mandeep and Harvey are sort of nodding at the back. Okay.
Social media.
Say again?
Like social media.
Yeah, so social media has an influence on us, doesn't it? Yeah.
Our parents.
Our parents, yeah, that's massive, isn't it? Yeah, so I think our parents and our families, that's a huge sort of conditioning factor, isn't it? I was saying at this class about 6 months ago, I go more regularly than this, but I was talking about it at the class about 6 months ago. I'd just been to visit my mum at the time. And I was noticing that I was subtly different when I was sort of interacting with my mum. And it's taken me about 49 years to get to that point, and and nearly 30 years of Buddhist practice as well. Like our responses to our family are so, I don't know if you can identify with this or whether it's just me, but we think we've been meditating for a while, we think we're changing, all of that sort of thing, and then somehow we go home and it's like we're a 13-year-old child again, So our family is a very, very strong influence on us, aren't they? What else is it that sort of conditions us, or conditions the way we behave or the way we think about things?
I would think anyone who you would aspire to be.
Okay, yeah. Say a bit more.
Well, I guess, if you see somebody and you see something within them that you want to be, you're going to probably change your actions to match theirs.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So anyone that you aspire to, or anyone maybe that you're inspired by, or would you say that it in a sort of positive sense or a negative sense, or both? Yeah.
Both probably.
Yeah, that's right. So anyone that you sort of, anyone that you look towards, that you want to be like, but that can be positive or negative, can't it? It might be somebody that has very, very positive values that you aspire to be more like, or that could be true of the negative as well, wouldn't it? Yeah, absolutely. So we're influenced by all sorts of people, aren't we? Like our families, social media, our friends, the people that we associate with. And because of that, we tend to pick up all sorts of views and ways of looking at the world, and there'll be all sorts of behaviours and ways of acting that go with that. And most of the time we tend, or certainly unless we become part of a community or a group that encourages us to examine that and look beyond that, then most of the time our views are unexamined. And I think, what I noticed when I started practicing Buddhism is it provides a context for actually having that examination and actually looking at, well, what is it that I actually think, and is that true or not? It provides a space where you can look at your responses to things, you can look at how you are, you can look at how you interact with people, and actually just have some space around that, and some awareness around that, and some mindfulness around that. One of the things there's a couple of things actually, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Like when I was growing up, so the goth years, like when I was growing up, I grew up in a small town in the north of England, and all of my friends, we basically used to go out and drink a lot and take a lot of drugs. And that was just what we did. And I sort of felt like that somehow that there was no ethical consequence to that. And it took me a long time to actually realise that that behaviour was not ethically neutral, that was causing harm to me and probably causing harm to other people and stopping me from sort of fulfilling my potential. It was, I mean, I don't know if I can make this clear, but it was a little bit complicated by the fact that I was quite interested in kind of late 60s counterculture as well. And I used to take quite a lot of psychedelics because of that. And, well, not because of that, but my interest was sort of concurrent with that. And I used to read a lot of literature about, people like Timothy Leary and Alan Watts and this sort of thing. And like the Buddha would often appear in these accounts and in these biographies and on the literature and on the graphics and that sort of thing. And somehow for me, the Buddha was all kind of tied up with that late 60s counterculture, which sort of somehow rubber stamped the behaviours that I was involved in. And it took me a long time to kind of untangle that and actually sort of, sort of see through that really, and start to see what the consequences of my actions might have been, particularly in the fact that I was sort of putting a ceiling on my own experience and my own development. Another one for me, and I'm not proud of this, but another view of mine that I clocked was like I grew up in, we didn't have a lot of money in my family, and the town where I came from was quite a poor family, and I didn't really know anyone with money, and I associated with people from a particular social class when I was growing up. So when I was growing up, I had a kind of a mistrust of people that weren't from that social class, and I had a mistrust of people that had money, and people, say that were privately educated or that came from families with a lot of money. And that was really subtle. And I noticed how that was clouding my interactions with people. And it's only after some years of Buddhist practice that I started to notice that and started to see what was really happening. And part of what enabled me to see that was that when you come to the Sangha, you start associating with all sorts of different people from all sorts of different backgrounds, people that have backgrounds that are very different from yours. Because what we tend to do is we have certain views about the world, and then what we do is we gravitate towards people that have similar views of the world, and we associate with those people. And what ends up happening is we sort of reinforce and deepen our own views, and we often don't associate with other people that are going to have different views from us. And that's very different when we come into the Sangha. We're not associating on the basis of class or similarity of political views or, interest in certain aspects of culture or whatever it is. Like that may be there. You may have those similarities with people, but that's not what we're associating on the basis of. So to go beyond that, we need to have a space where we can look at our views and kind of examine them in the light of having a bigger perspective. But not just that. I think we also need the perspective of somebody who's wiser than we are. And this is where this idea of the true individual comes in. So, the spiritual community, if you were to think about it in terms of like an image, you could have some people that were more experienced, perhaps coming down from the Buddha. I was thinking this yesterday actually when I was sat here during Sangha Day. It's lovely, we've got this beautiful image of the Buddha on the shrine here, and then we've got these images of the lotuses next to him. And it's almost like the lotuses are opening in response to the Buddha. And what they represent is our sort of opening and our growth. And you have the Buddha, and you have people that are sort of closest to him in terms of their wisdom and their experience. And then there's a kind of lineage that comes down to us. And in our community, there will be people who are wiser than we are. There will be people who are more experienced than we are. They can help us to examine our views and help us to kind of see what it is that we're actually the ways that we're approaching our lives and the way that we're thinking about things, and even, if it's appropriate, like where those things are tripping us up or where those things are causing us more suffering. So I was thinking about this. I mean, a few of you were here for Jnanavaccha's talk last week, so I can talk about Jnanavaccha like this because he's not here, so I'll slightly embarrass him by saying, Jnanavaccha is someone I really, really look up to. He's incredibly wise, he's incredibly compassionate. I really, really appreciate just actually knowing him. I've had the good fortune to get to know him and become friends with him over the years. And it's through connections like that, being associated with somebody who's much wiser than I am, that I've been able to sort of look at my own views and my own ways of approaching the world, and sort of come to wiser perspectives about things. And it's not that it's not then that somebody is going to tell you what to think, but what we can do for each other is to help each other to come to our own conclusions about things. So we have to do that. It's not that like I said, it's not like somebody's going to tell you what to think, and it's not like you can just understand the Buddha's teaching just by reading about it. It's like somehow it has to accord with your own understanding, so that you actually make that understanding your own. I don't know if I'm making that clear, but it's like the Buddha said, to not just take his teachings on trust. So he was very, very clear with all of his followers that they were not to just heard what he said and just sort of say, okay, well, the Buddha said it, therefore it must be true. He encouraged people to examine his teaching for themselves, so that they would come to their own conclusions. Now, you might look at that and think, or you might hear that and think, well, what that means is, the Buddha was just trying to give us a sense of confidence, that he doesn't want for us to take his teachings blindly on faith. But it doesn't just mean that. What it means is, you have to turn that teaching over in your mind until it actually becomes your own. Until it actually becomes, you come to your own realization about it. And this is where we go back to the idea of the true individual. So the true individual is somebody who has done that over and over and over again, so that the way that they actually think is a wise way of thinking. They're not just repeating things that they've heard, or they're not just quoting the Buddha. It's actually become the nature of their mind and the nature of their consciousness. And in order to do that, we need to turn the Buddha's teaching over and over again. And at the same time, the teaching of the Buddha can't land. So wisdom can't land in our minds unless we actually clear space for it and clear ground for it. So if we're full of all of these kind of views that I was talking about, certain ways of looking at the world, if we've got ways of looking at the world that are sort of antithetical to the way the Buddha would have taught, then we need to see those and kind of let go, so that we can create a space, a sort of space of receptivity, so that the Buddha's teaching can land, and so it can, I don't know how to finish my sentence, create a fresh way of looking, so it can almost like start to create a new mind in us. Okay, so maybe I'll just pause there for a moment and see if people have got any questions or comments about anything that I've said so far. Yes?
When someone releases or lets go of its various ideologies and social conditioning, they become, in the world out there, lonelier, generally. So what then?
You're saying that is the case?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit more, and then I'll maybe
because everybody's enthralled to those things. Now, so it's hard to sort of communicate and not to be very different.
Yeah.
Or dare I say it's superior, to communicate a sense of, because you're not falling for that game.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. So it may not always be pleasant, or it may not always be easy, because you've got a group, whatever it is, or you've got different groups in society that want you to conform in a certain way. You're not conforming. You're not sort of buying into whatever ideology it is, and that can be a lonely place, I think.
Even just on the level of a dinner party or something, gossip.
Yeah, that's right.
Stories.
That's right. So you might experience a lack of meaning in that context, or you might feel a bit lonely in that context, or you might decide that you don't want to take part in that sort of dinner party gossip anymore, and that might not be easy as well. So it's not always going to be easy or straightforward, and I think that's partly why we need a community. So you need a community of people who are not necessarily going to have the same views, but a community of people where everybody's trying to sort of go beyond those views. So everybody's not the same, but there's an acceptance of and a support of not just going along with whatever the status quo is. So you've sort of brought me to my next point. I appreciate you saying that, because that was going to be my next point, is that might not always be pleasant, and it might not always be easy. My experience is that there's a kind of a deeper joy that comes from living in that way, because actually starting to see through, we're sort of talking about sort of wrong views and so on, but that happens at all sorts of different levels, doesn't it? So some of it will be relatively benign, some of it might not be. But beginning to go beyond that, I think is difficult if you're just doing it on your own. For me, it's coincided with being part of a spiritual community, or at least part of a positive group, which is the community around the London Buddhist Centre. And my experience, and I know this isn't everyone's experience, is I actually was often quite surprised over the years when I sort of spoke up from time to time, or when I let people know that I was doing something different, or when I didn't agree with something that they were saying. I was chatting with a friend about this last night, and interestingly, she said exactly the same thing as what you were saying. She said there can be a point where you decided you're going to live your life slightly differently. You haven't gone beyond all human suffering, so you're not enlightened, you're not the Buddha, but you are still trying to live your life differently, and that can sometimes be difficult, or that can sometimes be lonely. She was saying exactly the same thing, actually. When you start to take that out into the world, say for example you've got a group of friends that all drink, and you decide that you don't want to do that anymore, well, how is that then in your group of friends? Or whatever it might be, you decide you're going to be vegetarian, and so this is one of the characteristics of the group, is that what they want to do is preserve whatever the values of that particular group are, and often they can feel very threatened when you decide to do something differently. My experience was a bit different from that. So my friends were actually very supportive when I, for example, stopped drinking. I stopped drinking when I was in my 20s, and I was still hanging out with a lot of people that did drink quite a bit. And they actually, I think I influenced quite a lot of my friends, and they were very positive about it. I remember when I left my job to go on a long Buddhist retreat. I left my job to go on a 4-month Buddhist retreat some years ago, and I expected people to sort of be a bit like, what are you doing? And people were extremely positive about it. So I think you are going to get a mix of responses when you challenge people or when you speak up. I suppose what I would come back to is if you have a friendship with someone, or you're in some kind of relationship with somebody, and they're not interested in your growth, they're only interested in you being part of whatever social fabric they're part of, then actually I would question the value of that relationship. That can be quite difficult and that can be quite challenging. But what I was encouraged by was often my friends actually recognising that what I was doing was really benefiting me, and that I seemed to be growing, I seemed to be happier, I seemed to be more fulfilled, that sort of thing, and there was something in that responded in them. But what also isn't easy as well is being part of a community that I think I was already talking about. The spiritual community is, I'll say a bit more about this as we go on, but the primary characteristic of the spiritual community is that what it's interested in is the growth of the people in it. So it's not interested in preserving itself at the cost of the growth of those people. So it may be interested in preserving itself, but it's not interested in that for its own sake, only so as a vehicle for people to grow within it. And it's also not interested in sort of preserving the status quo. So what that means is your friendships in the Sangha might be different from other friendships that you have. So yesterday I was sat here in the morning and I was talking about a friendship with somebody that I had when I first came along to the London Buddhist Centre. So she was an order member. It was quite an unlikely friendship. She was a woman who was 40-something years older than me at the time. I was in my early 30s. I think she was in her late 60s, so almost 40 years older. And we became friends. I won't tell the whole story now, but anyway, we became very good friends, and then she died some years later, and my friendship with her was very, very significant for me and really sort of brought me into this community, and I really, really appreciated it. But one of the things I appreciated about her it wasn't easy for me, because she would not be interested in pandering to me. She would point out my faults, and she could be quite direct about that. Like I remember being on retreat with her once, and she was talking about something. It was quite a lovely conversation, and then I sort of killed the conversation. She was talking about something, and I just came out with some sort of platitude. I can't remember what it was. Something like, "Oh well, if one's gonna something, then something." I don't like, those phrases that you just say. It doesn't mean anything. Like, why do you say it? And she just said, "Will you stop talking in platitudes?" She said, "You always do this. I say something and you just come out with these platitudes." And I was like, it was quite hard for me to hear that. And at the same time, I thought, you know what? She's right, actually. I'd come out with these stock phrases, and what it does is it just cuts dead any intimacy or any depth in the conversation. So I took that on board, and it wasn't easy to hear that, but it was one of the most valuable things anyone's ever said to me, actually. And what was lovely about it was there was no malice there. She just wanted me to grow. She wanted to point something out to me for the sake of my growth, for the sake of becoming a bigger person. And I remember this really well because, interesting, Pranyamanis talking about the winter retreat to the online people, and then Chris Lasara was talking about the winter retreat there. So I was on the winter retreat with her. This was like 2007 when we had that conversation. And on the winter retreat, you can either go for the first 5 days or the second days, or you can go for the whole 10 days. This is going to be another advert for the winter retreat, by the way. But, so she was on the team, so she was there for the whole 10 days. I just went for the first 5. And we'd had this conversation, and it was more or less just before we were about to come home. So I left with a bit of a sour taste in my mouth, and I because I was quite new, I had all sorts of assumptions then about what it might be like when she came home. Would she still be annoyed with me, all this sort of stuff. And we used to live in this block of flats at the top of Globe Road there, and that was partly how we got to know each other. Was I lived, it was a high rise, and I lived on one floor and she lived on the floor below. But I had keys to her flat because we were really good friends. So while she was on the second 5 days, before she came home, I went out and bought some flowers and left them on the kitchen table, filled her food with fridge, and filled her food with fridge. That's hard to do. Filled her fridge with food. And like made her some soup, so when she came home there'd be some hot food for her, you know. And a couple of hours after she got back, she just came upstairs and gave me the biggest hug. And she always used to say hello, darling, to everyone. That was how she used to greet everyone. She said, hello, darling, how are you? And I was like, I'm fine. Like, are we? And she was like, oh yeah, don't worry. You know, there's no like residual difficulty or annoyance. It was, she just wanted to point this thing out to me. For the sake of my growth. And I've had lots of people in the Sangha do that. And, you know, that's how it should be, in a sense. It's not going to be like your other friendships, where people are just, you know, you go out with your mates and you all encourage each other to do things that are actually no good for you and all of that sort of thing. You know, it's going to be different, and that's not always going to be... it's not necessarily always going to be pleasant, it's not always going to be easy, but it is going to lead to real depth and fulfillment, particularly in your friendships. So I thought I'd just go a bit of diversion here, which is me and my partner had a real deep dive on Saturday evening. We had a bit of a cultural evening, and we watched this cultural artefact, which is one of the greatest cultural artefacts of recent times, which was Legally Blonde. Has anyone seen Legally Blonde? Put your hands up, have you seen it? Yeah. Great film. I hadn't seen it before. I was really... I have to give some credit to somebody here, because the president of this centre is a man called Subhuti, that some of you might have heard speak. He comes and gives talks here periodically, comes and visits the centre. He's a very good friend of the centre. And I heard that when the team from the LBC went on a retreat once with Subhuti, they watched Legally Blonde on the retreat as well. So I was a bit intrigued. And what had happened was, myself and my partner, we really wanted to watch a film, but I think the last 2 or 3 weeks running, we just watched stuff that was like really good, but so harrowing. Like we watched, there's a remake of All Quiet on the Western Front on Netflix. Has anybody seen that? It's like First World War film, it's an amazing film, but my goodness, it's brutal, absolutely brutal. And then something else the week before, I can't remember what it was, but I just said, look, can we watch something like a comedy, like, you know, The Muppet Christmas Carol or something like that, you know. Anyway, we settled on Legally Blonde, and it's such a good film. And partly what stood out for me was what a breath of fresh air the main character was. Now, I'm not saying she's enlightened, but what was interesting about her is, like, she's, for those of you that haven't seen the film, she's this kind of like, you know, sort of blonde Beverly Hills type young woman who breaks up with her boyfriend breaks up with her, and that's because he's set on being a senator by the time he's 30, and he thinks she's not serious enough. So he's like, look, you know, for someone like me, I need to be going out. I think he said something like, I need to be going out with a Jackie O, not a Marilyn. Which I thought, goodness me, what an awful thing to say to someone. Anyway, she decides that by going to Harvard Law School, she can get him back. And I'm sure you can imagine what happens. You know, it's not too much of a spoiler. Not that you can probably go away and watch Legally Blonde anyway. But she discovers a much deeper sense of purpose by going to law school. It's really lovely. It's basically a tale of sort of human transformation. She becomes this. She sort of discovers her life purpose. Really, it's fantastic. Really good. But the thing that stood out for me about her is she goes to Harvard Law School, and she turns up. And she's got this kind of little lapdog. This was my favourite part of the film, was that the dog always has like different little outfits. Like at a graduation, he has like a little you know, like those hats, I can't remember what they're called, like a boater or something, isn't it? And turns up at Harvard Law School and the dog's got a little bow tie on and stuff like that. It's really great. And anyway, she turns up at Harvard Law School and, you know, she's dressed all in pink and she's wearing like designer gear and stuff like that. And everybody's like really, really dull. They're like, I don't know this about law students, but apparently the stereotype is that they're all very dull and they wear grey and stuff like that. And they all sit around and introduce themselves. But she doesn't immediately then change. So she doesn't come in and think, I don't mean she doesn't change in her mind. I mean, she doesn't immediately adapt to the way that they are. She just kind of stays the way that she is and is sort of confident in herself and assertive in herself and just applies herself to a task. So they're all sat there with their laptops and she's got this kind of this sort of pink heart-shaped notebook and a pink fluffy pen and stuff like that. And she's sort of confident enough in herself to not change in that way just for the sake of it. But she's really, really receptive. She's like the ideal student and she really, really quickly sort of gets into the subject. And I was thinking there's something about that for us to take on board, which is like sort of having that sense of confidence, but also just being really, really receptive as well. Because sometimes what you get is, you know, people like other people, not me, people come along to the Buddhist Center and somehow there's this sort of assumption that you need to be like other people. And you see people, you know, subtly sort of taking on values that are nothing to do with the Dharma or nothing to do with being spiritual. It's more like just a way of being, you know, like sometimes you see on retreat where people will sort of move very, very slowly and they're doing the dishes very slowly or something like that. Or, you know, it's like people start talking in a particular way because the teachers talk in a particular way. Like there was a whole sort of generation of people in Sri Ratna that used to, I don't know if anybody's heard Sangharakshita's talks. Like Sangharakshita had a very, very sort of strange way of speaking. And then what happened was a lot of his followers started speaking in that strange way as well, you know. And it was nothing to do with sort of Dharma practice or Buddhism. It's just that, you know, they were sort of emulating their teacher. And that's fine, but we don't need to do that, basically. You know, in a way, maybe it's natural in a community that we sort of imitate each other. But that's not what we need to do, actually. We need to just engage with the teachings. And I was saying yesterday, this friend of mine that I was talking about, Vidya Jyoti, this was one of the things that really impressed me about her was she was very, very kind of receptive, but she was very much herself as well. Okay, so maybe I'll just pause for a moment there again and see if there's any other questions before I go on to the next bit.
How to distinguish the confidence that you just mentioned from arrogance? Like, because I feel like sometimes in some certain social context, if I reveal some part of me that, you know, might not be the same as the rest of the group, I sometimes feel that I might come across as arrogant instead of being confident. So just want to see how you address that.
So the question, just for people at home, the question was about revealing oneself in a group, whether one had the confidence to do that, and something about arrogance as well. I mean, I think the thing that I was talking about is I think there's a quality of receptivity there, and I think one doesn't get that with a certain kind of arrogance. So, you know, sort of being confident, but also knowing what we don't know, like being confident up to a certain level, but knowing what we don't know and having a sort of degree of receptivity and openness. I mean, I was sort of joking about that with the Legally Blonde thing, but what I was trying to get at was that there was this real sense of her not just imitating other people, but actually being open to applying herself to this sort of path of knowledge, which, you know, I was seeing as sort of a metaphor for the spiritual path, basically. It's not a spiritual path, but it was a path of growth for her. But there was a real receptivity in that. She was prepared to listen to her teachers. she was prepared to learn from her mistakes and so on. And I think in answer to your question, it's very important who we choose to open up to, I think. Coming back to this thing about the spiritual community, I think there's something about knowing when people share our values and knowing, being confident that actually we can open up to people because they share those values of perhaps openness, like a lack of cynicism, or there's a degree of compassion there, that you know that people aren't going to ridicule you if you expose your vulnerability, for example. I know with certain friends that I have that won't happen, but that's because they share my values. So I think sometimes you might be surprised, but I think we need to exercise judgment about who we open up to. Okay. So just to come back to this thing about the group, and then I'll start wrapping up. So what we mean by the group is a group of people that are primarily interested in preserving the values of whatever that group is. So they're not interested in the growth of the individual. So to the extent that a group does that, to the extent that they are more interested in the preservation of the group than they are in the growth of the individual, then to that extent they are a group. And the spiritual community, to the extent that they are interested in the growth of the individual and not in the preservation of the group, other than it being a vehicle for the growth of the individual, to that extent then they're a spiritual community. Does that make sense to people? I think that's the primary thing that I would want to say. That can be... That's a whole sliding scale, isn't it, with the group? So you might have some groups that are actually quite positive. And in the text, actually, Bhante talks about the idea of the positive group. So you might have some groups like, I don't know, like a community group or something like that that's, it's relatively benign, it's trying to do good things, but it's also, it's not primarily interested in the growth of the individual. Or, I'm sure you can think of other sort of examples of that sort of thing. And that can be very, very negative as well. Like at the extreme end, essentially that's how conflict and wars start, isn't it? You can't start a war on your own. You need a group of people, whether it's, an army or a country or a political party or whatever it is, that are so entrenched in the preservation of whatever ideology it is that they have, that they're prepared to send people to war, or they're prepared to kill people for it, or whatever it is. I mean, an example came to my mind with the work that I do. I mean, I've talked about this before, so some of you know that I work for a charity that's run by Three Buddhist, and we fundraise in the UK and we give money to organisations in India, Nepal and Bangladesh, and my role is to oversee the implementation of that work. And we work with communities in India, particularly that are discriminated against because of the caste system. So people that are born into very low social strata, and they're heavily, heavily discriminated against. I've met people, I met somebody a few years ago who his father was killed for transgressing a sort of what was perceived to be a caste boundary. So he was basically, he inherited some land and a house, and the upper caste people of his village decided that he was getting above his station, and they murdered his father and they brutally tortured his mother. That's the group at its worst, is when you've got a very, very strong ideology and people are so attached to it that they're prepared to hurt people, even kill people. So that's at like the extreme end. And there's all sorts in between there, isn't there? But ultimately, that's the thing about the group, is it's not interested in your growth. And what we're trying to do, what we're aspiring to do, well, the way Bhante puts it is he talks about it being utterly different. So we're trying to help each individual person to grow. That's what the spiritual community is trying to do. And that's what we're aspiring to do as, sometimes a group, sometimes a positive group, and then with glimpses of being a spiritual community. So I think within that as well, another thing that came to my mind is, I sort of touched on this before, but being clear about what does and doesn't matter. So we're not concerned with, this touches on what I was saying earlier on, we're not concerned with where people come from. We're not concerned with people's background. We're not concerned with how people dress. We're not concerned with... There's a lovely moment in Legally Blonde where she turns up to a fancy dress party and somebody's told her it's a kind of fancy dress party. She turns up in fancy dress and no one else is in fancy dress, and she's sort of turns up, and you would be really embarrassed at that, wouldn't you? And she just sort of carries on, sort of dressed as a bunny with bunny ears and stuff like that. Nice moment. Anyway, so we're not concerned with people's political persuasions. We're not concerned with how people dress. We're not concerned with how people talk, because none of those things are ethical matters, and none of those things will have, to the extent that those things don't have an impact on your growth or your behaviour or how you sort of behave ethically. What we're trying to do is something different, within that, what we're concerned with is the growth of each person in the spiritual community. And I'll just finish up by saying, so Bhante talks about the only danger for the spiritual community is that people are constantly trying to bring it down to the level of the group. So you have a spiritual community, but our instinct for the group is so strong. It's such a strong instinct in us, isn't it? I mean, we're social animals, we're pack animals. That's why it's painful when somebody points out your faults to you, like I was discussing earlier. Because what you might feel then is there's a danger that somehow like you're going to be cast out of the group or something like that. But that's not what we're doing here. We're not interested in doing that. What we're interested in is the growth of people. But that instinct in us to behave as a group is very, very strong. So it's useful for us just to reflect on that. Are we actually behaving as a member of a group, or are we behaving as a member of a spiritual community? I was thinking it's a bit like, if you think of this as an image, it's a bit like you have the spiritual community up here somewhere, and what they're doing is they're sort of offering a hand down to the group. Because the way that the group becomes a spiritual community is by associating with people that are more developed than they are, or who are wiser than they are. For us to associate with those people, it's like they offer us a hand down. But what we're trying to do as a group is sort of pull them down to our level. And it's just really good to be aware of that, I think. We're aspiring not to do that, really. And then the last thing I want to say is that all sounds, I don't know, that all sounds a little bit dry, or a little bit technical, or a little bit kind of I don't know, but what I wanted to say is, like, I want to communicate something of the fact that is really a gift, because what that actually means is we come into contact with people who are able to help us see the ways in which we cause suffering to ourselves and other people, and through our association with those people, and through our taking on board the teachings of those people down the ages, we're able to live a more fulfilled life. We're able to live a life with more clarity, with better communication, with better relationships, all of these sorts of things. And the joy of that's really a gift, Like, I was really aware of that yesterday when we were celebrating Sangha Day. It felt like a real celebration, that there is it's really, really precious. You know, we talk about Sangha, spiritual community, as one of the three jewels, and we talk about it like that for a reason. That it is something precious, that it is something beautiful, and it's also, you know, it's rare. It's rare to come across that, and it's, you know, but through our practice together, we can have glimpses of being a spiritual community. Okay, so maybe I'll leave it there for this evening, and yeah, so that's it for this week. So come back next week, and we'll be carrying on our exploration of what is the Sangha. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, if you'd like to put your cushions and mats to the side.